Hello, Pittsburgh. This is Trib Live's From the Newsroom podcast, bringing you top stories from TribLive.com. I'm your host, Zac Gibson, and today I'm sitting down with staff writer and reporter Anna Mayers, who has been interning with Trib Live since 2023. We're here to dive into her recent article, which cites the economic growth of Western Pennsylvania because of its changing demographics. Hi, Anna.
Hi, Zach.
Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So, talk to me about your experience visiting Beechview.
Absolutely. So Beechview is located in Allegheny County, close to Brookline and Mount Washington. It's kind of sandwiched in there. And I went to Beechview knowing that a lot of Latino-owned businesses and also Latino nonprofits and development groups are all headquartered in Beechview. So I was able to kind of walk up and along Beechview in the main road and do a lot of my interviews for this story.
Tell me about what the experience was like. Any takeaways from the community?
Yeah, I think I always get a little bit nervous before doing interviews, and this time a little bit more because I knew that I had a high likelihood of needing to do some interviews in Spanish, and that would be my first time doing an interview in Spanish. So I went up to Las Palmas. I'd been there before, so it was kind of the most, I guess, comfortable place for me to start. So I went up to Las Palmas, kind of walked up and down the aisles a bit, got my bearings, and picked out a coconut water, went up to the cashier, and after I checked out, kind of introduced myself, said that I'm Anna Mayers, reporter from the Trib, hoping to do a story about the Latino community, and introduced myself in Spanish. And at the end, I always like to add, I know I'm not the best Spanish speaker. If you want to switch to English, let's do it. And she said, actually, this is perfect. I feel a lot more comfortable speaking in Spanish. Why don't we start chatting in Spanish? And from there, I'm just so grateful. She really shared her story with me, and some of her kind of coworkers came over and were interested and started chatting hey, who's this girl, in Spanish. And when they saw I understood and was following the conversation, were super welcoming, oh my gosh, you know Spanish, that's so cool, thank you for coming. From there, the director of marketing ended up seeing me and took some videos for their Instagram. It was just this very welcoming, and I think that set the tone for how this whole piece kind of went down. I think I would talk to one person and it would be oh my gosh, I need to connect you with so and so from this other group doing amazing work for the Latino community. And I think that the Latino community in Pittsburgh is just so unified. And I started to realize that everyone knew everyone. Word really quickly spread that I was working on the piece, and people bent over backwards to make sure that I was talking to the right people and that I felt welcomed kind of into the community for the weeks that I was working and putting together this piece. And it just became evident that the Latino community in Pittsburgh is small but mighty and rapidly growing.
Wow. This is a concentrated experience as you were in Beechview, but the face of Western Pennsylvania is indeed changing. So the population by the numbers, according to the Allegheny Latinx Needs Assessment for 2022, found that there is a growing density in Pittsburgh's diversity.
Yeah, you're so right. And from 2010 to 2020, Pittsburgh's overall population grew by less than 1%, while in that same decade, Pittsburgh's Latino population grew by 80%. And those numbers are really significant.
Wow. So what you found with this new growth in the population, there also comes a boost in economic growth. So you interviewed Melanie Marie Boyer, the executive director of the Pittsburgh Metropolitan Area Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And she tells us that Latinas are most likely, out of any demographic, to start a small business.
Absolutely. And she just has a beautiful fire and passion for spreading the truth about what Latinas are doing in the United States for the economy. The fact that Hispanic women are responsible for 50% of all new jobs in the U.S. for the last 4 years, according to the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. I think just these numbers are not being reported on. And I think the data is there. And I really hoped with this story to kind of put a face to the economic growth and positive things that are happening to the U.S. economy because of Latinas and Latinos in the Pittsburgh area.
Wow. So 50% of all new jobs in the U.S. for the last 4 years. That is quite a figure.
Yeah.
So I know that there's obviously a economic change that's been going on, but there's also a visual and cultural change for the Beechview residents. While you were there, you met Brenda Garcia. Tell me about her.
Yeah, absolutely. So Brenda is the communications director at Casa San Jose, which is also headquartered in Beechview. And actually, growing up, she received aid from Casa San Jose and now works there, which I think is really beautiful. And that's the case for a lot of people who work at these Latino-led nonprofits. So growing up, she told me a lot of stories about her childhood. She's originally from, her family is from Mexico, but she grew up in Pittsburgh back when the Latino population was very small. And she would talk about how maybe if she heard Spanish at a grocery store, her immediate response was, "Mom, we have to go talk to them in Spanish. It's a friend." And just seeing the transition over, the 2+ decades she's lived in Pittsburgh, where now Spanish is everywhere. And I think it was really cool to talk with someone whose kind of lifespan spans the change of the Pittsburgh demographic and the growing Latino population. And one of the things that really stood out to me was she highlighted the vibrance that Latinos are bringing to Pittsburgh. And she talked about how while the non-Latino community is on the population decline, the Latino community is on the rise, and talking about how that is bringing hope and vibrance and growth to places like Beechview and a lot of these buildings that really were abandoned or not being used that are now fully renovated, beautiful spaces where, community centers. And I think Beechview, just as kind of like a structure, represents that vibrance, these new businesses, these new restaurants that are bringing lots of traffic to the area.
And it's not something this is not something that's necessarily new, but like for Pittsburgh, it's always been a destination for diversity. With Little Italy, with Polish Hill, and such a large Jewish population, Pittsburgh has always had these pockets where there's more densely diverse areas. But Beechview is, as Garcia said, the Latino hub.
Yeah, absolutely.
So moving on a little bit, let's talk about Western Pennsylvania as a changing scape. It seems that Western Pennsylvania has become a destination for this community in the terms of economic growth. There are migrants coming from California, New York, and even Florida, all coming to Pennsylvania for opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one really interesting conversation I had was with Dan DeBone, who's president CEO of the Westmoreland County Chamber of Commerce. And he talked about these conversations that they've been having in Westmoreland County of, they've lost 12,000 residents since the last census. They need workers, they need people. And the conversation is actually more around how can we attract immigrants? Like, there are immigrants, there's Latinos coming to the US. How do we make Pittsburgh? How do we make Western Pennsylvania? How do we make Westmoreland County a place they want to go? And I think that's a really unique conversation to be having, and this idea that there's kind of competition to bring immigrants to places in Western Pennsylvania that historically have been shrinking.
So even with this welcoming atmosphere and with this measured growth, there has still been a stigma that has been dealt with. Can you talk about that with your experiences covering Beechview?
Absolutely. I think even thinking about the reporting experience, I came to Beechview and there was a couple interactions where I was asked, like, what are you doing here? What is this piece? Who are you? What is your connection with the Latino community? And I got to share about how I studied abroad in Spain, spent a lot of time with a Colombian Latino family, and kind of how that put that desire on my heart that I shouldn't have needed to go to Spain to encounter Spanish-speaking people, and that there's such a growth of the Spanish-speaking population in my own backyard. And I think after I shared that story, people felt a lot more comfortable and like they could trust me. And I think a lot of that distrust is founded. I had some conversations with people who wanted to know what newspaper I was from, who were relieved that I was from the Trib because they'd had experience with other papers who maybe had recently put out articles that had furthered victim or villain narratives against the Latino community. And I think, especially as a member of the press, as a journalist, it's on me to kind of build that bridge back and like accepting that there has been maybe other journalists who have burnt bridges with this community historically. And I really was just so blown away by the trust and the welcome that was extended towards me, because I think walking into that situation knowing there's been, even in Pittsburgh, instances of this community feeling like they weren't represented well by Pittsburgh newspapers.
So you came at this article from a matter-of-fact perspective. And the fact is that there is a rapidly growing, vibrant population here in Pittsburgh.
Mhm.
So let's talk about the figures from the Latino Donor Collective and Arizona State University about Pennsylvania's economic growth.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Pittsburgh's Latino community economy is growing rapidly. So they saw an 18% growth between 2011 and 2021, with $36 billion in gross domestic income, representing 4.2% of the state's growth. And another really interesting study that I loved was done by Arizona State University on Pennsylvania's economic growth, which saw an average 1.1% increase per year, while the Pennsylvania's Latino sub-economy on its own saw an average 6.2% growth in the same time frame. So we're just seeing this rapid growth that we can specifically trace to the Latino community. So while there's been a little bit of like stagnation, the Latino community is really bringing vibrance when it comes to economic growth. And I think these numbers just really reflect how the growing Latino workforce is offsetting the losses from a decreasing base of non-Latino workers in Western Pennsylvania.
Okay. So it's my understanding that you have a similar story out. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very much an input person. And so at the end of doing all of my research for these stories, I realized I kind of had two separate stories. And so this one that came out on Sunday is more of the economic growth coming from the community, putting information to the dis and misinformation when it comes to the Latino community and its positive influence in our economy. The second story that's coming out is called A Face to Latino Immigrants. And so it walks through 4 different profiles of Latino immigrants that I had the pleasure of interviewing. And I can give a quick example of one of the stories. I talked with Edgar Solis, and he was born in Pittsburgh, is a Pittsburgh and an American citizen, but his mom was deported. And so he went through this very difficult process where he ended up being raised and growing up in Mexico, even though he was from Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. And eventually when he was 12, he was moved back to Pittsburgh, and he talked about kind of his changing identity, experiences with bullying, and now eventually graduating from high school and realizing that what he wants to do with his life is give back to the Latino community in Pittsburgh that supported him. And I think that it's such a beautiful picture and kind of this counter narrative that we don't hear about, this really like beautiful soul who is trying to give back to his community. And so I really like this story because it gives more of a face and a little bit of in-depth stories of what are the different immigrant experiences, because no story is the same. And so I like this story because it's a collection of comparing and contrasting that no Latino is the same and no person is the same.
Anna, thank you for joining me today to talk about your stories, and I can't wait to read the one that's coming out.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure to talk about the story with you.
Thanks for joining. If you enjoyed this week's episode, share the podcast to help keep Western PA locally informed with insightful discussion and the latest news from your area. It's an easy way to spread the word, and it helps our podcast reach more people like you. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify and turn on episode notifications so you never miss new content. Once again, I'm Zac Gibson, and this is From the Newsroom.